Coming up next on the Breadwinning Mums.
My mom always told me a quote when I was little, and I think looking back that really helped me. And her quote constantly was, you can clean your room happy or you can clean your room sad, but you're gonna clean your room.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jane Lim. On the Breadwinning Mums podcast, we debunk the myths of working mums, cheer each other on, and show the world that it's okay to be a mum and still pursue excellence in your chosen area of expertise. Today we're chatting with Petra Langan-Stark, a fellow breadwinning mum with 2 boys, Hudson and Sawyer. Petra is a career coach at the Australian Graduate School of Management, and she holds a portfolio of casual roles to balance the demands of her special needs son, Sawyer. She shared with us her life story about traveling the world with a toddler, navigating through crisis when life throws you a curveball, and always asking the question of how can we make it work during challenging times. Here we go with Petra Langan-Stark. Hello, Petra.
Hi, Jane. How are you?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on your podcast.
So we obviously met at the Australian Graduate School of Management, where you're the career coach, but you haven't always worked there. Can you tell us a little bit more about you?
Sure. So I grew up in the United States. So I was born in New York, but I grew up in Miami, Florida. I probably never thought that I'd be living in Australia, but I've been here 10 years now. And so I suppose from a career path, do you mean my journey and things like that?
Yeah, both career and as a person, as a mom, as a woman.
Sure. So career-wise, I wasn't sure, which I feel makes me a better career coach because I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do and how I wanted to balance my life. And so I majored in international relations, and I went to a school called the College of William and Mary, which is I suppose like a public Ivy school, which is about 2.5 hours away from Washington, D.C. And I really enjoyed the school. So I decided, because I like to travel and I really appreciated learning about other cultures, I would do international relations. So that's what my major was in. But then as you have it, I also met an amazing professor who I just really enjoyed her subjects. So she taught anthropology, which is, the study of culture and humans basically, but she specialized in primatology, and which is the study of apes. And so I just ended up taking all these courses, and I did a thesis for my minor in at Richmond Zoo, actually, basically studying the social interactions between female and male chimpanzees for 20 hours at the zoo. Yep. And so that really led me to my first job coming out of university, which was at the Jane Goodall Institute.
Wow.
Yeah, so I worked at Jane Goodall. She's amazing. She's about 80 something years old now. And she is the one who learned that chimpanzees use tools in the wild. Yeah. But in her older life, I suppose the last 20 years or so, she's been working on a program called Roots and Shoots. And Roots and Shoots is basically the idea that kids are the next generation and kids have amazing ideas. So parents support groups of children to come up with some environmental project. It could be something like recycling at their school, or coming up with a community initiative, or something bigger. And so she would go and present on her ideas. And my first job coming out of university was the photographer to follow her, which is great.
Yeah.
So that's how I started. And then I've worked as a local journalist, kind of concurrently to that, working on, going around talking to people, opening up businesses, probably doing similar things to what you're doing, going in the community, meeting people, talking to different people. And I enjoyed all of that. But I also really like the idea of working with kids and helping. So for me, I think my theme throughout my career has been how can I help people? But as I've grown, how can I help people and have a sustainable life for myself? So as I've matured, kind of shifting to you want to add value and maybe help. As a 20-year-old became advocate as an, I'm not that old, but as you get older and progress. So I ended up teaching in Texas, which is I went through a program to teach at without having a teaching degree. So basically, non-teaching professionals to go teach in high-risk schools. So lots of issues with kids from low socioeconomic status backgrounds or kids whose English isn't their first language. That kind of a thing. So I did that for a while, enjoyed that. Ended up getting married in there. Had my first son in there.
Yeah. So you met your husband, Steve, way before that, though, right? You met him back in New York?
I met him when I was finishing up at the College of William and Mary. He's 4 years older than me, so he was working in New York City.
Yeah.
So we met basically because we had both transferred into that university, and we had a lot in common that way. So
nice.
Yeah. So that was really balancing early on is, negotiations, changing jobs, changing cities. And then for us, he worked in New York City as an investment banker. And so what we had in common was this love for travel and adventure. And so we packed up and we thought we were going on a little adventure, and we haven't lived in the United States since then.
Yeah, amazing. That's a, full life you've had there, and you're only a third of the way there. So you can't wait what the next 2/3 going to look like. But I'd like to talk about your work back at studying primatology. Did you go through Harari's work back then, or what do you think about Harari's take on?
I haven't actually. Her work, my professor's work was actually more specific. It was on the contrast between chimpanzees and a subspecies called bonobos, which I hadn't heard about before I'd taken this. And the idea there is that chimpanzees are kind of naturally aggressive. So in the wild, they'll have conflicts. There's cases where they kill each other, things like that. So they get quite aggressive. And bonobos, which are genetically almost the same thing, are quite peaceful, and they don't have these same social hierarchies. And that was part of my thesis, is to go and study this one. And so they've seen that in the wild. So my professor was more interested in like intelligence of animals. So chimpanzees, bonobos, also bottlenose dolphins, African gray parrots. And so she's very interested in, just how intelligent are they really? And specifically the social structures of some of these more intelligent species. So that was the angle that she was really going on.
Yep. Okay. Interesting. All right. And so you met Steve, you got married in Texas, and then you traveled the world together. What was the first destination outside of the US?
So we decided, I had, when I grew up, my parents separated, and my dad for a while dated a woman who is half French and half Brazilian. And so I spent 2 summers going to France, probably when I was 16 and then 17 by myself, living with a French family for one of those summers and really getting immersed in the culture. So I had a strong interest in going to France and trying to, try to pick that up and see if I could move from intermediate French into being able to, become fluent. And Steve is always my partner. He's just, he's pretty much up for everything, and he has a high energy level. And so to give him full credit, he didn't really speak French at all, but he said, let's just go, and I'll start at the beginning and you can help me out. So for the first 5 months, Hudson was 13 months old. And I remember having a conversation with my mom saying, people don't really travel with little kids. And we just said, well, we do. So
Mm.
we're gonna go. And we
Yeah.
did. And we had a great time and we used a lot of our savings and had the most amazing time. We lived in Montpellier, France, and we did French language school for about 4 to 5 hours a day. Sent Hudson
Mm.
to a little, French daycare center. So some of his first
He
words were
picked up.
actually in French, which is
Yeah.
interesting.
Wow.
Um, and then, yeah, we traveled. We went to Italy. We traveled around Europe a little bit during the
Mm.
weekends and things. And then we realized that we actually do have a child that we're responsible for. We do need to make a salary.
Yeah.
And so our next step was Steve first looked for jobs in finance, but it wasn't as easy as we thought then. I guess was this 2012? No, 2010. Yeah, 2011, 2012. So
Okay.
it wasn't he just wasn't having luck. So then I thought I can use my teaching degree. Let me see if I can apply for some international teaching positions.
Mm.
So I did, and I got a role teaching in the Emirate of Abu Dhabi,
Mm.
which I kind of joke and I say, if you get a job in New South Wales and you're thinking, great, I'm going to go to Sydney, and then they put you out in Orange, it's fine. It's just not Sydney.
Yeah.
So instead of Abu Dhabi or Dubai, we were put in a small town. I say small, it's still, 200,000 people or something. It's called
Yeah.
Al Ain, and it's on the border with Oman. And so
Mm.
we had a very different experience where, it's rolling sand dunes, conservative dress. So I taught at an all-girl government school for
Mm.
year three girls.
Yeah.
The students spoke their local dialect of Arabic, and then
Mm.
they learned standard Arabic in school. And then
Mm.
comes along the Western teachers to teach all the subjects in English. And there are no resources. So for instance, curriculum, they just said, well, you're from America, just teach them the curriculum.
Mm.
And so that was really interesting because you really needed to rely on your colleagues and come up with a plan as a team. So that's what I did. So I worked really closely with the other year three teacher. We divided the work. I did English and more of like the social subjects, and she did math
Mm.
and science because that was her
Mm.
background. And it was a really interesting cultural experience, but it wasn't a place that we wanted to stay for a long time. And
Mm.
so actually we were in Dubai for Hudson's gymnastics class, and it was an AGSM representative who approached Steve and said, have you heard of the AGSM?
Mm.
And he had worked for National Australia Bank out of New York City. So for him, he knew that he loved Australia. He'd been to Sydney a lot, probably, 10 times or something for
Mm.
work. And
Mm.
so he just thought, well, that's a really good way to leave the Middle East and to
Mm.
start the next adventure.
Yep.
So he applied for that. He
Mm.
got, I
He
think,
applied for an MBA at AGSM at the time, right?
yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Yeah.
He
Okay.
applied. Yep. And then I think he got a partial scholarship. So we decided we could do it. So he accepted the offer. We went back to the States for about 6 months, visited everyone, and then moved to Australia on Christmas Day, actually. We took
Mm.
off Christmas Eve. We landed the 26th of December in
Mm.
2013, and
Mm.
we've been here ever since. So that
Wow.
started our Australian adventure.
How long have you known Steve for? When did you guys meet?
I've known him. I was 21, so it's like 15, 16 years we've been married. I should know this exactly. 12 or 13 years, something like that. Yeah, so
Okay.
basically I was 21 and he was 25 when we first met. So we really, in a sense, grew up together in terms of
Yeah.
maturing and sharing
Yeah.
experiences and things like that. So
Yeah. Okay. And how long did you guys go out before you finally committed to each
about
other?
4.5 years. So
4.5 years.
I
Wow.
graduated university. I did my Jane Goodall and journalist job. I moved to Texas. I did the
Mm.
teaching. And then I was living in Texas for a while. He was still in New York City. And it
Mm.
was basically a conversation of, well, I'll propose, but if you don't say yes, I'm not moving to Texas. I
Okay.
felt was more than fair.
Yeah.
And
He's hedging his
that's
bet for
it.
sure.
That's
Like
it. So
any iBankers would, you
exactly, which I
know.
think is fair because
Yeah.
obviously if you move out of New York City, that's like a major hub for investment
Yeah.
banking.
Yeah. You're worth it, but you better make it happen type of thing.
Exactly, exactly. So that's
Okay.
what we did. So yeah, about 4.5
Nice.
years before we got married.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. I mean, 21 must be a very young age to really find out, who you are as a person, what you want to do in life, but also whether if, Steve is the right person for the rest of your life. When did you finally know? Before he
Good
proposed, of
question.
course.
I think that's a very good question. I think you often feel older than you are. So I think, my younger self felt like I had everything together and I had an understanding of things. But I think what actually happens is, you make a choice every day to stick it out with someone. And if
Mm,
they're not your sister, your mother, your father, you have a choice all the
mm,
time,
mm,
to not continue that journey. So I think for
mm,
us, we are both stubborn and adventurous and
mm,
determined people. And the
mm,
one thing that's kept us together is we're always willing to try. And I
mm.
think that always willing to try is the key because it hasn't always been a smooth sailing road where, we get
Yeah.
along constantly. We've definitely had our arguments and life disagreements and directional differences in opinions. But I
Mm.
think for us, it's just about trying with that person and then being able to identify the good qualities even when you're upset with the other person. So I think
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah,
other
that's
important
important.
quality.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I would say when I moved to Texas, I partially moved to Texas because I knew that it would either work or it wouldn't.
Yeah.
And I wasn't really willing. When I was working in Washington, D.C., it's about 4 hours apart.
Mm.
And I could just see that happening for 10 years. And
Yeah.
I just decided, you know what? If something's going to work out, then we need to make that happen. And if it isn't going to work out, better to know sooner than later. And so,
Yeah.
this is a bit brave of me because I think I
Mm.
was maybe 23, 24 by the time I moved over to Texas. I didn't know
Mm.
anyone in Texas.
Mm.
Didn't know what the job would be like, but I haven't really been afraid of just trying different things.
Yeah.
And Steve has a story. We flew to Australia with his job.
Mm.
This was about 3 months before he proposed. And apparently his story goes, I had one of those airplane blankets over my head and I didn't have any makeup on or anything. You're just traveling for 16 hours.
Yeah.
I don't know. I said something to him and he said in his mind, he looked at me and instead of saying, why would I marry this girl? In his mind, he said, why wouldn't I marry this girl? So that's his
Ah.
story. And so that's the story he tells. So he says he knew then, and
Yeah.
then it was just a matter of when and how he felt like
When?
doing it. And
Yeah.
so it's good. Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. That's lovely.
Mhm.
So tell us a little bit more about your life now. So you're married to Steve with two children?
Yes. So once we moved to Australia and he was in the AGSM program, which, as you know, is pretty demanding in terms of time and requirement to study and quite challenging to balance if you have kids or partners.
Mm.
So we were in the program and I fell pregnant with my second son.
Mm.
And so plan was we would just stay, maybe a year, maybe he'd get a year work experience in Australia, but the plan was not to stay.
Mm.
But my youngest son was born with special needs. So he has cerebral palsy, which is like a physical disability, and,
Mm.
kind of global delay. So intellectual disability at a moderate level too. And so that really just changed our world. And I think for us, it changed our world that you can plan all you want, but you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, what you can control is how you respond to things
Mm.
and your perspective. That's all you can do.
Mm.
So once he was born, he's 9 and he's had 20 brain surgeries. And he's
Mm.
had 13 of them in the first 6 months of his life. So if
Mm.
you can imagine trying to finish your AGSM program while in
Yeah.
hospital,
Yeah.
it wasn't really something that was possible.
Mm.
So for us, the next step was how can we stay because he wasn't able to fly. He'd basically
Mm.
had a stroke, so he wasn't able to get on a plane and go back to the States.
Mm.
And we also felt, Australia, one of the amazing things about the country is even as a student, you have access to hospital care and it's
Mm.
covered. and the US has the whole host of problems, but medical insurance is one of them. And so the only way that we could stay is if one of us studied longer in order to keep a student visa. And so I had decided that I wanted to do, after my teaching, I wanted to make an impact, but as I mentioned before, not at such a granular level, not with just 30 kids, but in general. And so I decided to do a master's in environmental policy. So I did that, through my pregnancy, graduated. And then about 10 weeks later, Sawyer was born with all these complications. So that went out the window. Can't say I've used that much. But basically what happened then is I just decided, well, Sawyer isn't rolling. He's not sitting. He's not doing all these things that we know are milestones for bubs. So I decided to do a Doctor of Physiotherapy degree. So I went to Macquarie University, did a 3-year Doctor of Physiotherapy degree. Lots of work. And so that worked out. And that basically allowed Steve to then apply for jobs with full working rights. We went on many rolling contracts of 3 months, 3 months later, 3 months later. And then finally, we were able to get his company to sponsor us eventually. So we got citizenship last year, and took 9 years, but we did it. And now we're totally happy here.
So I obviously met your family, your beautiful family, at the AGSM ASA family picnic. And from my perspective as a mum of 2 young kids, I really, pull my hats off to you, with you and Steve, actually, with how beautiful you are as a family, but how strong you are, and how you're both able to make things work, regardless of what life throws at you. You continue to make things work. And it shows with the way you are around both of your boys, so both Hudson and Sawyer. I don't see any differences in the way you treat them, and that's great. So you have 2 boys, Hudson and Sawyer, 9 and 11.
9 and 12.
9 and 12. Okay. How has Hudson been throughout all of these ordeals? Obviously, he was still quite young. He was 3 when Sawyer came into the picture. But throughout all that, how was he? How did he take it?
Yeah, I think, talking back to having some resilience or having that mindset, for me, my mom always told me a quote when I was little. And I think looking back, that really helped me. And her quote constantly was, you can clean your room happy, or you can clean your room sad, but you're going to clean your room. That's it. So when Sawyer came along, it was kind of, like you can feel sorry for yourself, which is easy to do, that you have, this tremendous responsibility to this little person who needs all the support that you weren't planning on needing to provide. But it doesn't help you. It doesn't help him. It doesn't help Hudson. It doesn't help Steve. Or you can just get on with it and just really appreciate, I think that instead of just seeing the good things or just the bad things, I just saw everything all together. So you notice the hardships, you notice the positives. And so that was our approach. And I think having that approach helped Hudson, because it was more like, when he says now he's 12, well, one day when you guys are old, I'm going to need to look after Sawyer. We're like, yes. Some parents would be like, no, it's okay. We're like, no, actually, one day when I can't walk, you do need to look after your brother. But we're very open about it. And, I always tell him, like, not now, not tomorrow, not in 10 years, not in 20 years. But it's more, I think that we just, we never said we can't do something, because Sawyer didn't learn to walk till he was almost 5. Thank goodness for that physio degree. That's really the value. Because I don't practice it very much. But I think, so we wouldn't say, oh, well, because he can't walk, we're not going to go on this trail ride. Steve would just say, well, you know what, I'm just going to carry him. And I would say, he's kind of heavy, Steve. And Steve would just figure out a way, or we'll take breaks, or we'll bring sandwiches, or we'll do this. So I think because we continued to try to do things, and we would be honest, like, it's true, Hudson, that we do have to modify it, or it's true that we need to leave a bit earlier because your brother is fatigued, and that's fine. Or it's also true, Sawyer is not allowed to fly, for instance.
Mm.
So we drive to Queensland, we
Mm.
drive to Melbourne.
Mm.
So then we say, well, so there are things that we have to accommodate for, but I think having the attitude that you can do it, it's more ask yourself how instead of say that you can't. And I
Yep.
think that that's helped Hudson have a really good attitude and outlook.
Yep.
Um, he loves his brother, and he's very protective.
Mm.
So as an example, he decided to change schools when Sawyer started primary school.
Mm.
Um, so he could be with his brother. And I said, you don't have to change schools. It's 5 minutes away. It's not a big deal. And he just said, no, if this other school isn't going to let my brother come here, I want to change schools for him. So
Mm.
he's a very selfless kid, but it does have impacts. For instance, Hudson didn't learn to ride his bike till he was 9 because I couldn't manage, looking after someone who can't walk,
Both.
running
Mm.
after a bike, pushing it. So
Yeah.
there's some real implications that are true,
Mm.
but we also try to divide and conquer. For instance, I've gone back to the US a few times and taken Hudson with me. So there's mom or dad time only,
Yep.
and so we try
Yep.
to balance it that way.
Yep. Nice. Do you think that Hudson's a mature and kind person to start with, or do you think that he's learned to really nurture that part of him when Sawyer came into the family as well?
I think that's another good question in terms of nature versus nurture and where that falls. I think it's a lot of teaching and modeling, to be honest, because it's not natural to be selfless.
Yeah.
It's something that you actually have to practice and learn. And then we try to, because he's a child, when you've played with Sawyer so nicely for an hour, when we go out to dinner, you can get an ice cream because you've been really nice to your brother. So it's like positively rewarding the behavior that you want. But I also think that it is part of his personality too. He is, I would say he's very mature in his social interactions with people, but then he's quite immature in other ways because he's always played down to Sawyer's age, and Sawyer instead of 9 is more like 5. And so sometimes with his own age group, Steve and I will look at him and we'll say, wow, he still has a ways to go. He's really a 12-year-old who's more on the young end. He's not about to be a teenager. He's really still just a kid. And so you have kind of a juxtaposition of what happens with that too.
So how are you juggling work and family life? I think your family life is already full to start with, but you're still involved at the AGSM. You're a career coach. You're heavily involved. How are you and Steve managing that?
I think what I did is for a while, and this is something I learned just kind of, how do you manage having many women have multiple kids and a role, and some senior roles, but how do you manage having a special needs kid because the needs are just greater? And I think for me, I tried for a while thinking, maybe I can find a full-time role that really works for me. But in reality, Sawyer just needs more of my time and he needs my flexibility. So what I've done is I've actually created a portfolio of casual roles. So I am a casual careers coach at AGSM, and I've been involved since about the time Sawyer was born in terms of doing resume reviews and things. All through my doctor of physio, I worked 1 day a week with AGSM. But once I finished, I started to pick it up and do more and more roles. So for me, I now work about 4 days at AGSM. I do 1 day a week with the employability team, which is career coaching for the undergrads and PhD students and postgrad students. And then I mark one course. So I have a course that is about employability, helping undergrads to secure roles. So things like we make them go out and do an informational interview and work on their resume and cover letter and interview skills and skills analysis. And then I also, because after that 3 years, I didn't want to lose the whole physiotherapy certification. So I work on a Saturday roster at a public hospital. And so basically it sounds crazy. I know. But for me, let's say that Sawyer goes to hospital because I'm casual. I can just say, you know what, I'm not working for 3 weeks. And I don't have to ask. I went to Gold Coast just this past week. Don't have to ask. I just say, I give a heads up out of courtesy, of course, for the team, but it's allowed me the flexibility that if I need to drop it I can
Mm.
drop things and deal with that. And if I want to scale one thing up, or I could work at AGSM for 2 days a week and, cut the other roles that I do a bit less often for a while. So for me, is actually a mentor who told me, she said, Petra, you don't want a full-time role. What you're saying to me is that you want salary security. And
Mm.
that was my light bulb of, actually, that's what I want. Is I just want to
Mm.
know that I can provide for my family in roles that are rewarding, where I have the ability to influence things.
Mm.
But where, if I need to, I can still just say, I don't even have to say what I'm doing. I can just on Thursday decide to take the afternoon and do a therapy session for Sawyer. So
Mm.
that's how I balance my work life kid balance.
Did you always know that you were going to be a career woman?
No, I thought I would be one of these. Like, I always knew I wanted to have kids, and I always wanted to have 3 kids since I was, I don't know,
Ah,
in high school, let's just say. And I
yeah.
think I'm the only child. So I think for
Ah.
me, I just really, as soon as I had Hudson, I was like, I'm definitely having at least one more,
Mm.
because I missed that a lot. I had 2 older cousins who I saw all the time.
Mm.
And I saw they were, they're 2 years apart. They're both girls. So I saw that sister bond. And
Yeah.
I just, they'd always play with me, but I just wasn't
Yeah.
exactly, they wouldn't,
Yeah.
they were nicer to me because I wasn't one of their sisters, really. And so I just saw that, and that was really important to me to have a
Yep.
bigger family. So I think that's always been my idea. And also in
Yep.
Australia now, it's Steve and I and our little family. I got my mom over here during COVID, which is amazing.
Mm. Mm.
But it's also looking forward. And if they're all in Australia, they have to have their own support network and things one day. So
Mm. What part of your travel journey so far do you think would you consider to be the highlight in your life so far?
hmm, let's see. I would say before kids, we were most adventurous, and
Mm.
we did a lot of traveling. When Steve was working in New York City, we had the funds to be able to have these grand adventures. So we went
Mm.
to Thailand, we went all the way up. We took a boat across to Laos. We went to Cambodia, and we saw Angkor Wat and the history there. We went to Japan. We also, my favorite place, my first place, the funny part is I had always traveled. So my dad worked at the University of Miami. And so his work was in like Latin American politics.
Mm.
So he would travel a lot around Latin America and the Caribbean. That's
Mm.
why I grew up in that location. And then as he got older and changed roles, he worked a lot in Africa. So
Wow.
I always had the travel bug from when I was 5, because
Yeah.
because my dad's travels, and he would take us places.
Nice.
So the first place but when I met Steve, he had never left the United States. So
Mm.
imagine 25, and he had been all over the US, but he had never traveled internationally.
Mm.
And we decided to go to Costa Rica,
Mm.
which is amazing because you have the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean and the rainforest and like all kinds of amazing things, and a different language, but Spanish isn't too hard to get around with.
Mm.
Probably because I grew up in Miami too. But but I think what I didn't appreciate is the roads, especially this is back in 2005,
Mm.
were horrible. There's like potholes. So and I don't drive that well in like really rustic conditions, but he's really good. He drives manual cars. So I basically had him drive from the airport about 2 hours the first night down this super bumpy road. It was getting dark. We couldn't see, couldn't read the signs. We don't have cell phones. You have like old-fashioned maps then.
Mm.
And so we had a travel journal, and we went to see Volcan Poas, like the volcano Poas. And his first entry was called Poas Nightmare. And then I was like, oh no, I have ruined this. I have made this. I should have taken him to like the Bahamas or something like totally chilled out. And instead we went on this epic adventure. And we had a
Yeah.
great time. We stayed another place by this big volcano where they said park your car downhill. And as we're staying there, you can like see the lava coming down the volcano, and I'm just thinking I might have misjudged this. However, um, I guess the whole thing worked because Steve he just got hooked, and he's like, that was great. Like,
Yeah.
so before kids, we did all kinds of very adventurous trips like that.
Mm.
And then Hudson's actually been to 17 countries
Wow.
um, by the time Sawyer was born. So before he was
Because
3,
mm,
that's how much traveling we did with him. So
that's amazing.
I
Because that's
sometimes,
the time when you went to France and then you
mm,
traveled around Europe, Italy, and then you
yep.
went to Abu Dhabi, Emirates.
We also took
Amazing.
we went to South Africa while I was working in the Emirates, and we did a big trip there. That was
Wow.
quite adventurous too. We
Yeah.
went to Jordan. I went to Petra because I felt like I needed to go
Yeah.
see
You have
Petra.
to. Yeah.
Um, and we went all around. Yeah, so we really did do lots of traveling with him.
Mm.
So I wonder if maybe that's also kind of where he gets his mature, the kid went everywhere with us, and
Yeah.
it's got to shape you a little bit.
Yeah. Well, he's become resilient and more worldly, I guess. Do you have any tips on people who are traveling with young kids, but like proper traveling, of course,
Hmm,
not just like going
sure.
to one city? Yeah.
Sure. I think it's again that question of don't just say, oh, first of all, throw out nap time. Like I know that some parents are quite scheduled, but if you want to travel with kids, we had the notion of, a child is an extension of us and they're
Mm,
quite resilient. And if they
mm,
skip their nap or they don't go to bed on time, it's fine because you
mm,
only have one chance to kind of go and travel. So my first thing is let go of the schedule for the child and just be flexible, and
mm,
I promise they will sleep when they're tired and eat when they're hungry, and it all works out. So
yeah.
that allowed us to see more and do more because we didn't
Mm,
cater for
mm,
specific times of the day.
mm,
um, and then my other tip is really, again, just ask, how can I do this with a child,
mm,
rather than, oh, they're too young, I can't do it. Now, within reason,
yeah.
of course.
Yeah.
Obviously, you need to prioritize safety and things like that. But, there's lots of things you can still do if you're just a bit creative with how to do it.
Mm, mm,
We had a really cheap stroller that could fold down. So that was very helpful in terms of being able to fold it, go up and down stairs,
mm,
carry it if we did a little walk and things like that.
mm,
So yeah, and don't get hung up, you're gonna have you're gonna have clothes that are dirty, you don't have a spare t-shirt, it's fine. They'll be
mm,
fine. So I think
yeah.
it's just having that attitude of it's not gonna go perfectly. I think
Mm,
our worst flight ever, Hudson was 22 months old when we went from the Emirates to South Africa.
mm,
And we had to refuel in Johannesburg to get to Cape Town. And they, for whatever reason, they made me keep that loop on my seatbelt with him sitting in my lap. He's
mm,
quite big by then.
mm, mm,
And he was just screaming and screaming because he wanted to go on the floor, and they
mm,
wouldn't let me unfasten his seatbelt. But my other advice is you can do anything for 24 hours.
mm,
And that was a bad 24 hours, but then we got there and had a great trip. So
mm.
it won't go according to plan, but you can still be creative in how you go about it.
Yeah, I really like your how can I
Hmm.
philosophy because during the family picnic you mentioned about, Sawyer had, I think you mentioned a stroke when he was still inside your tummy.
Yeah.
And so that created a lot of complications later on, but you don't limit yourself with what does that mean to your life and his life. You just make it work. So how can you make it work? How can you go on that travel? How can you go on that holiday? With all of the limiting conditions, but you're still trying to make it work. I really like that. The fact that it's across areas of your life.
Yeah. I think it's important. And then I think too, you give and you take with him, but he's always up for adventures.
Mm,
And you also have to be honest. He'll say things because one of he can't really open and close one of his hands, and so he'll say like, my hand doesn't work. And it's also being honest. It's like, actually, yeah, it doesn't really work, does it? But
mm,
we have this one, and well, what if you just pull it this way? Or for instance, we buy them remote control cars that you can do with just one hand. So then
mm,
we have to spend more time on that. But again, it's yeah, it just doesn't help. I think it's more, it just doesn't help to sit in the negative, and it's
mm,
easier to sit in the negative, but it's not helpful.
mm.
So I think for us, that's what keeps us going. And you don't always get it right, but you keep trying.
So if you could go back to your younger self, I guess to a point where your parents just separated,
Mhm.
what one advice would you give your younger self, knowing all of the wisdom and knowledge you know now?
Yeah. I think when I was younger, and I see it a lot in career coaching, like I was quite a humble, introverted teenager and kid, is just be brave. Like
Mm.
what did my mom say? There's another quote that I didn't especially like. She said, "You wouldn't worry what people think about you if you realize how seldom they do."
Yeah.
And as like a 15-year-old girl, you're like, that is really like not reassuring that like no one is thinking about me at all. But I think it's actually
Yeah.
true. It's just when you stand up and you give a presentation, people aren't judging you. They want to hear what you have to say.
Mm.
So I think for my younger self, I would often maybe second guess like, oh, can I do that job? Maybe I
Mm.
need more, maybe, this person has more experience than I do. But in
Mm.
fact, it's really not necessarily the case. It's often people who are just brave
Mm.
and you can be humble and, appreciative of things, but you can be confident too. So I would have told my younger self, be confident, go for things earlier. Don't second guess yourself, give it a try. And then also if things don't work out, um, it's not the end of the world. Because I think my younger self and many people in their, 20s might feel like it's quite a big deal to fail.
Mm.
But it's actually just part of growth.
Mm.
And you don't grow and learn unless sometimes things don't work out. So
Yeah. Yeah. That's right. It's
yeah.
part of learning. You
I
just learn from
probably
it
would
and
have
move
wished,
on.
yeah, like if I could have figured out that doing a portfolio and becoming more of a consultant earlier, that
Mm.
really benefited me. And I spent maybe 3 or 4 years trying to find the right job. And
Mm.
I'm much happier just having pieced things together. But it requires being brave because there's no job security.
Mm.
You do a good job, the work is there. You don't have good quality work, the work isn't there.
Mm.
Um, but if you're brave, then it works out. So I
Yeah.
think, yeah, be
Okay.
brave. That's my advice. Be brave. Go try
I
things.
love it. I love it. Okay. And what's your alpha mom song? So if you have deadlines looming at work and your kids are sick and you don't feel well yourself, what song do you play on the back of your mental mind to make it through the week?
I think that's more my quote. I go to my quote of you can clean your room happy or clean your room sad, but you're going to clean it. So for me, it's that. And I think my other motivation that's always driven me is my grandma came from Lithuania, so Eastern Europe, when
Mm.
she was 18 on a boat to
Mm.
America. She
Mm.
didn't speak English, she didn't have any money. She sewed men's suits in New York City and
Wow.
just seeing like her resilience.
Mm.
So my song in the back is probably my grandma singing in Lithuanian, just her songs and getting on with things. And I think
Mm.
yeah, like watching somebody just dedicate their life for the next generation to have more, really.
Yeah.
And then my mom's done the same for me.
Mm.
Um, outside of my grandma maybe rolling over in her grave because I've moved the whole family to Australia. I think it's just,
It's still
yeah.
land of the milk and honey.
I've
Just a
heard
bit
it's the
far.
lucky country. This is what a lot, actually, when I work in physio, a lot of the elderly patients who've come here often say Australia is the lucky country. So, um,
Yeah.
must be true.
Okay. And have you reached a point in your life where you really felt like life's really gotten the better out of you? And how did you and Steve deal with that?
I think probably when Sawyer was born, it was very scary. Um, I didn't know any of the medical terminologies, like having a stroke. He basically had a stroke late in pregnancy. So when he was born, he lost 65% of one hemisphere of his brain, like gets kind of
Mm.
reabsorbed and disappears. And then this little person has to go with 2/3 of what everyone else has. And so there was a lot of basically in order to process fluid and things, he has something called a shunt. So it's an implant that goes into his head and it regulates the fluid. And so that's why he's had so many surgeries are these, if the shunt breaks, then it's within 24 hours, you need to be in the hospital and you have to have a brain surgery. So that's scary if you think about, I want to go to Broome, Australia. Well, there's no neurosurgeon there. So
Mm.
again, where else can you go? How else can you have a trip that's adventurous that is safe for him? So I think that probably like that first, from when he was born, that first 6 months was a breaking point in the sense of, Steve was studying full time, which meant we had no money. We didn't know anybody because we were relatively new, so we didn't really have good friends. We had a 3.5-year-old who still didn't understand and needed their parents. Luckily, my mom flew out and she basically took care of Hudson for us and cooked for us and things. But that was scary. I remember at one point, I think Sawyer, he ended up getting an infection. He got meningitis. I think he was like 3 months old, and so many things were going wrong. And, having that medical assessment of actually like, I understand the turn of events here and stuff. So I think that was the hardest. And then how do you come out of that? Well, luckily he stopped having surgery. So that was one. I think sometimes you're just in crisis mode. So that was crisis mode for 6 months. And then, then you look around, you're like, okay, things are not going to get worse now. Like now we can just start to think about how we can make things better. And then from that point, we could start to build again.
Perfect. All right. And so for other breadwinning moms listening to us today, who are trying to juggle family and working life, but especially those with special needs kids or differently abled kids, what one advice would you give them to make it through the phase that they're in?
Find resources for special need moms. There's so many resources out there, and it's really important to be educated to advocate for your child. So for instance, even for Hudson, there's an organization called Little Dreamers, and that focuses on siblings who have kids with special needs. So that helps him feel like it's all about him sometimes. There's lots of amazing organizations that do holiday camps for kids with special needs. And the more that you get involved in communities, it's just nice to make those friendships with other parents who are going through something similar. So I would just say, go and find the resources, and also just ask for second opinions, because we were told, Sawyer's not going to see, he's not going to walk, he's not going to talk. And he did walk. He talks a lot, which is great to hear. And all of the gains he makes, he keeps. So listen to your instinct, but also get all of those resources and ask questions and spend the time doing that, because it sets your whole family up. I guess mentally, physically, you just get the support that you need when you reach out.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Well, Petra, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Jane.
Thank you so much for listening to Breadwinning Mums. Please subscribe and leave us some feedback so we can continue to make the show better for you. If you know a fellow breadwinning mum, please share the show so we can cheer each other on. Until next time.